It began quietly, deep in the Pacific, far from any cheering crowds or flashing headlines. A single American submarine, steel, salt, and silence, drifted through dark waters that had already claimed hundreds of lives. Above, the Empire of Japan ruled the seas. Convoys moved like veins, feeding the Pacific war machine, and the Imperial Navy guarded them with ruthless precision. But one U.S. submarine, forgotten by most today, was about to rewrite the rules of naval warfare. In just 4 days, it would sink 5 Japanese warships, stun the enemy, and leave even the American High Command in disbelief. They called her the Destroyer Killer. To understand her story, we have to go back to early 1944, when the tide of the Pacific War was turning, but victory was far from certain. Japan's empire still stretched across thousands of miles. Their fleets carried troops, ammunition, and vital fuel to remote strongholds scattered through the ocean. And the U.S. Navy's submarines were SPAY, their silent hunters, the only American units that could slip undetected into enemy-controlled waters. But it was a dangerous game. Japanese destroyers hunted subs relentlessly, dropping hundreds of depth charges that could crush steel like paper. Every patrol could be your last. The submarine at the heart of this story, USS Harder, was a Gato-class sub commanded by one of the most daring officers in the entire Pacific Fleet, Commander Samuel D. Dealey. To his crew, he was calm, fearless, almost superhuman. To the Japanese Navy, he would soon become a nightmare. Dealey's Harder had already seen action. She had patrolled enemy waters before, dodging depth charges and sinking transports. But in May of 1944, when Harder sailed from Fremantle, Australia, she was about to embark on her 5th war patrol, the one that would earn her a place in history. Her orders were straightforward but perilous. Head north toward the Philippines. Seek out enemy convoys. Disrupt supply lines feeding Japanese garrisons in the Pacific. It sounded routine, but Dealey had no intention of being routine. He believed submarines were meant to strike at the heart of the enemy, to take out their destroyers, the very ships designed to kill subs like his. That idea alone was considered suicidal. Destroyers were fast, heavily armed, and equipped with sonar and depth charges that could easily end a submarine's mission in minutes. Most subcommanders avoided them at all costs. But not Dealey. He wanted to prove that even destroyers could be hunted, that a well-handled submarine could outthink, outmaneuver, and outfight the hunter. And he was about to prove it in the most dramatic way possible. As Harder slipped through the Sulu Sea, her sonar picked up faint propeller echoes. The crew tensed. Japanese destroyers were moving nearby, escorting supply ships toward a base. Dealey knew well, Tawi-Tawi, one of Japan's key naval anchorages. It was a heavily guarded area, the kind of place no submarine dared to linger. But that's exactly where Dealey headed. He ordered Harder to periscope depth. Through the narrow lens, the captain spotted 3 silhouettes cutting across the water Japanese destroyers. They were part of Admiral Takeo Kurita's fleet, the same fleet, preparing for what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Most commanders would have turned away. Dealey turned toward them. He maneuvered Harder into position, silent as the deep. The first torpedo hissed out, slicing the sea like a steel arrow. Moments later, a flash erupted on the horizon. One destroyer was gone. Within seconds, the calm surface became chaos, alarms, explosions, the thunder of depth charges raining down. Harder dove hard, twisting through layers of water as explosions echoed through her hull. The lights flickered, pipes rattled, but she held together. Hours later, when the sea finally went quiet, Dealey brought his sub back up to periscope depth. The Japanese destroyer Minazuki was sinking beneath the waves. He had done the unthinkable, a submarine taking out a destroyer in broad daylight, under heavy escort. But that was only the beginning. Word of the attack reached the Japanese fleet almost instantly. Admiral Kurita was furious and shaken. How could an American submarine penetrate one of the most secure naval zones in the Pacific? Orders went out to hunt the intruder at all costs. But Dealey wasn't finished. Instead of fleeing, Harder stayed close, circling the area like a shadow. The crew could hardly believe it. Their commander was going back for more. On the 7th of June, 1944, just 2 days after the first strike, Harder sighted another destroyer near Tawi. Once again, Dealey lined up his shot, steady hands guiding the periscope. The crew waited in silence. Then, "Fire 1! Fire 2!" Twin torpedoes streaked through the depths. Moments later, another violent explosion tore the Eight. Ocean open. A second destroyer, the Hayanami, split in two and went under. 2 destroyers in 2 days. The Japanese Navy couldn't believe it. The base at Tawi went on full alert. Every ship scrambled to find the invisible attacker haunting their waters. But Harder was already slipping away, hunting again. Dealey and his men were running low on torpedoes, their nerves frayed, their submarine battered by near-constant depth-charge attacks. Still, the captain refused to retreat. He believed that as long as they were out here, the Japanese fleet couldn't rest, and for 4 relentless days he kept the pressure on, pushing Harder and her crew beyond all limits. By the time those 4 days were over, the sea around Tawi would be littered with burning wrecks and rising oil slicks. The Japanese Navy would send frantic reports to Tokyo describing a ghost submarine that no one could catch, and Commander Dealey would be forever remembered as the man who turned the hunter into the hunted. But the true scale of what Harder achieved, the numbers, the risks, and the final moments of her legendary run were even more incredible than anyone imagined. And in the next part of this story, you'll see how, ship by ship, torpedo by torpedo, Dealey's submarine carved her name into history and shocked the entire Japanese Navy. The morning after Harder's second kill, the crew was running on little sleep. Depth charges had pounded them through the night, explosions so close they shook bolts loose from the ceiling. Inside the sub, men whispered prayers, some clutching good luck tokens, others staring silently at the bulkhead, waiting for the next blast. But their captain was calm. Commander Samuel Dealey moved through the narrow passageway, steady and composed. He spoke softly, his confidence contagious. "Gentlemen," he said, "we're not done yet." On the 9th of June 1944, the Harder approached the western approaches of Tawi. Again, a place crawling with destroyers, mines, and aircraft patrols. Dealey knew they were being hunted. Every sonar ping meant danger. Every shadow on the periscope might be death. But he also knew that the Japanese fleet anchored there was preparing for a major operation, one that could threaten the upcoming Allied landings in the Philippines. If he could disrupt them now, it could save thousands of lives later. That morning, through a thin layer of fog, the sonar picked up new contacts, fast-moving, shallow-draft vessels closing in. Destroyers. Again. Most sub-commanders would dive deep and hide. Dealey grinned. He wanted them closer. He ordered Harder to rise to periscope depth, turned the scope toward the noise, and there they were, 3 sleek Japanese destroyers cutting through the water, hunting. Their crews didn't know it yet, but they were being stalked by the very sub they'd been ordered to kill. Dealey lined up his shot. "Fire 1! Fire 2!" The torpedoes streaked out, slicing through the green water. Moments later, a blinding explosion erupted beneath the lead destroyer. The ship lurched upward, broke apart, and began to sink stern first, flames trailing from her decks. It was the Tanikaze, a veteran destroyer of the Japanese fleet, now vanishing beneath the surface. The remaining destroyers went mad, racing in zigzags, dropping depth charges in furious bursts. Harder dove hard, her hull groaning under the pressure. Depth charges detonated all around her, shaking the submarine like a rag doll. The lights went out, gauges shattered. For hours, Dealey and his crew endured what they later described as hell underwater. When it was finally over, they surfaced under the cover of night. The crew was exhausted, their nerves shredded. But they were alive, and they'd taken down a third destroyer. 3 ships in 3 days. Word of Harder's rampage was spreading fast across the Pacific. Japanese radio. Intercepts were filled with panic and disbelief. Reports described a phantom submarine destroying destroyers faster than any known vessel. Some officers refused to believe it, claiming it must be propaganda. But the wrecks told the truth. Dealey's daring was so unusual that even his fellow American commanders were stunned. Destroyers were supposed to be submarine killers, not victims. Yet, Harder was turning the tables, one after another. On June 10, the 4th day, Harder joined forces with another submarine, USS Redfin, to patrol near Borneo. The 2 subs exchanged coded messages and agreed to cover different approaches. At dawn, Harder's sonar man picked up new contacts, another group of destroyers sweeping the area. Dealey didn't hesitate. He ordered Harder into a position that most would consider suicidal inside a destroyer screen, surrounded on all sides. The crew held their breath. The torpedo tubes were flooded. "Fire 1!" Dealey shouted. Then, "Fire 2!" The first torpedo struck home, a thunderous detonation, followed by a shockwave that rolled across the sea. The target, the Hiburi, went down in minutes, exploding in a cloud of oil and fire. The second destroyer turned, charging toward Harder at full speed, its sonar echo screaming louder with each second. Depth charges tumbled into the sea. Harder dove, twisting violently, as explosions rippled around her. In the control room, men clutched the walls to keep from falling. The smell of fuel and sweat filled the air. One sailor muttered, "This is it," but the captain remained unshaken. Dealey kept his eyes fixed on the depth gauge, guiding his submarine lower, then leveling off just above the seafloor. When the explosions stopped, he whispered to his executive officer, "Now we go up." Minutes later, the sub surfaced again. Through the periscope, he saw burning debris scattered across the waves. The destroyer had vanished. 4 destroyers. Gone. 4 in 4 days. By now, the Japanese Navy had issued direct orders to every warship in the area. Find and destroy the submarine. Harder at all costs. Patrols doubled. Aircraft combed the seas from dawn till dusk. But Harder was nowhere to be found. Dealey had one last trick left. Later that same day, he detected yet another destroyer, this one patrolling near Basilan Strait. Harder was down to her final torpedoes, only 2 left. The crew debated whether it was worth the risk. But Dealey didn't hesitate. He raised the periscope, locked onto the destroyer, and said quietly, "We'll make these 2 count." He fired both torpedoes. The seconds crawled by. Then, a massive explosion split the silence. A column of fire shot into the air as the Japanese destroyer Hayanami, the 5th in just 4 days, erupted and began to sink. The crew of the Harder erupted in cheers. 5 enemy warships gone, a record no submarine had ever achieved in such a short time. When the smoke cleared, the sea around Basilan was covered in oil, debris, and silence. Dealey finally turned Harder south, heading toward safer waters. His mission had been a total success. In just 4 days, he had crippled Japanese destroyer strength across the region, delayed the movement of the fleet, and spread confusion throughout their command. For the first time, the hunters were afraid. American intelligence began intercepting frantic messages from Japanese bases, reports of a ghost submarine that struck at night and vanished by dawn. Some commanders even believed multiple submarines were operating together. But no, it was just one. One boat, one commander, one legend. USS Harder had become the most feared submarine in the Pacific. Her record shocked both friend and foe. And yet, her story was not over, because only weeks later, Commander Dealey and his crew would face their greatest test, one that would determine whether Harder's legend would live on forever or vanish beneath the waves. By the time the USS Harder returned to port after that legendary patrol, she was a name whispered with awe across the Pacific Fleet. 5 Japanese destroyers in 4 days, an impossible record that no other submarine would ever match. When she docked at Fremantle, Australia, the crew stepped ashore as quiet heroes. Their uniforms were stained, their faces pale from weeks of combat, but their spirits were unbroken. Commander Samuel D. Dealey received word that Admiral Christie himself wanted to meet him. And when the two men shook hands, the Admiral simply said, "You've made history, Sam." But even heroes don't rest long in war. Within weeks, Harder was being refitted and resupplied for what would become her 6th and final patrol. Dealey could have requested a desk job. He'd earned it many times over. Instead, he chose to go back out. In August 1944, the Harder slipped away again, this time to the dangerous waters off the Philippines. Her mission was to support Allied landings by striking Japanese supply convoys and rescuing downed airmen. It was supposed to be a routine operation, but fate had something else planned. For weeks, Harder prowled the coast, dodging patrols and trading coded messages with nearby submarines like Haddo and Hake. They called her the Destroyer Killer, now a nickname that carried both respect and a hint of fear. Every sailor in the fleet knew what she had done. Even the Japanese Navy had issued special warnings to its destroyer captains, "Beware the Harder." On the morning of the 24th of August 1944, Harder was working with USS Hake near Dasol Bay in the South China Sea. They were deep in enemy territory, and every mile was a gamble. Just before sunrise, Harder moved closer to shore to check for Japanese activity. Through the mist, the periscope picked up a shape, a destroyer escort, the CD-22. Dealey decided to attack. It would be his last. At 7:28 a.m., the torpedo doors opened. The crew waited for the familiar command, "Fire 1." But before they could launch, the Japanese ship turned directly toward them. The hunter had been spotted. A deadly game began. Harder dove deep, evading sonar pings that echoed through the hull. Then came the first pattern of depth charges. Explosions rocked the submarine, throwing men against the bulkheads. Glass shattered. Lights flickered. The crew tried to level her out, but more charges followed closer, louder, brutal. One explosion slammed so close that the hull groaned like thunder. In the control room, alarms screamed. Pressure gauges spun wildly. Then, silence. USS Hake, positioned several miles away, reported hearing 5 heavy depth-charge detonations in quick succession. Then nothing. No sonar pings, no radio messages, no sign of life. Hours later, the sea where Harder had been was quiet again, just oil, bubbles, and debris floating on the surface. The destroyer killer was gone. All 80 men aboard were lost. The U.S. Navy waited, hoping for word that she might have survived, that Dealey had somehow slipped away again, as he always had. But the days turned into weeks, and no signal came. Eventually, Harder was declared lost, with all hands. When the news reached Fremantle, silence fell across the submarine base. Even hardened sailors, men who had faced death a dozen times, stood in stunned disbelief. Dealey's crew had been like legends to them. Now, they were ghosts. Admiral Christie wrote in his official report, "Harder's loss was a tragedy beyond words." But her record stands as a symbol of what courage, skill, and determination can achieve against impossible odds. The Japanese Navy never forgot her either. In after-action reports, they described her as a demon submarine, a vessel that seemed to appear and vanish at will, striking destroyers faster than they could react. Some Japanese officers even refused to believe it had been just one submarine. They thought there must have been an entire wolf pack hunting them, but there wasn't. There was only the Harder and the man who commanded her. For his extraordinary heroism, Commander Samuel D. Dealey was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, along with 4 Navy Crosses and a Silver Star, making him one of the most decorated submarine commanders in U.S. history. His crew received the Presidential Unit Citation, a rare honor reserved for those who achieved something beyond comprehension. Even decades later, naval historians still marvel at what Harder accomplished in those 4 days. It wasn't just the tonnage she sank, it was the way she did it. She went after destroyers, the very ships built to hunt submarines and turned the ocean into their grave. In doing so, she shattered one of the most deeply held fears among submariners, that destroyers were untouchable. Today, her name lives on in silence beneath the sea. The wreck of USS Harder was discovered in 2023, resting on the ocean floor, at a depth of more than 3,000 feet, her hull still largely intact, torpedo tubes closed, as if waiting for her captain's next command. For a moment, it was as if history itself took a breath. Looking at her final resting place, you can almost imagine the sound of her engines, the whispers of her crew, and the voice of her commander saying, "We're not done yet." But she was. Her story ended in fire and depth, but her legend never sank. Because in the vast, silent expanse of the Pacific, few names echo louder than hers. The USS Harder, the destroyer killer. The submarine that made even the Japanese Navy tremble, and the crew who proved that courage can turn steel into legend.